Hi, everybody. This is Conor from Kensington Konnect, Kensington Park Senior Living. We're so glad you're here today for our week 5 of Kensington Konnect called The Wonders of Whiskey. We have Davis Green here and Matt Hardiman from the Dish and Dram, which is a wonderful restaurant downtown Kensington. We're big fans of theirs here at Kensington Park, and we're going to talk all about whiskey today. So they have some really interesting information about the history of Kensington and of course about whiskey, bourbon, Scotch, and rye. Matt and Davis have been at Dish and Dram 3 years respectively. And we're really glad to have them here today. If you have any questions, feel free to write in the chat. I will be taking those questions and we'll share them with Matt and Davis. But they're coming to you live from the Dish and Dram. So we're excited to have them and I will turn it over to them.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, guys.
Thanks for joining us today. My name is Davis. I started with the Dish and Dram when it opened about 4.5 years ago. I'm the general manager here. It's been a great 4 years. Kensington's been really supportive of us. And we have a great relationship with Kensington Park Senior Living Facility. So I'd like to say thank you to them and thank you to everyone for joining us. With me is Matt. He's our head bartender here. If you come in, he'll be the guy behind the bar. So our purpose of talking about whiskey with you today is to make the topic a little less intimidating so that you can come in to the Dish and Dram or your other local watering hole and talk with Matt or a bartender and really engage with whiskey as a topic. We know it can be intimidating. There was a period of time when there was elitism around it and it was hard to engage with. And let's be honest, the first time everyone drinks whiskey is not enjoyable for anybody. Even the people that love it today, it was a learning process where they learned to enjoy it. And part of that was the same information that we're going to give to you today. We're going to do that. I'm going to start with a little local history, go into the basics and science of distilling and whiskey. Then we're going to go through some geography terms about Scotch, Irish whiskey, international whiskey, and explore various cocktails that are made with it. And if you have any questions, we'd love this to be a back and forth. So please take Conor up on her offer and write some questions down and we'll be happy to respond to them as we can. So I'm going to dive in with a little history of Kensington because it's actually a little interesting. One of the most common questions we get is what dram means in the Dish and Dram. It started as a measurement for a small amount of liquid. Colloquially in the United Kingdom, that became a small drink of whiskey. And Kensington was dry until 2012, actually. They were dry for a very long time. A local restaurateur named Jeff Black, if you are local, you might remember Addie's or a series of restaurants he has in DC. He engaged with Kensington to, when he was talking about expanding his restaurant group. And in front of the town hall, he told them that he could not make the economics of a restaurant work in a dry town. So that restaurant eventually became Black's Market over in Garrett Park, just on the other side of Connecticut. And a couple years later, the town reversed their decision and started offering liquor licenses. And that was the first domino that created the process for the Dish and Dram being here today. Whiskey and distillation in general has been around for several thousand years. Many ancient cultures, Egypt, India, China, they all have at least the idea or at least the understanding of what distillation was thousands of years ago. In fact, the first process or the first use of distillation was not as a beverage, but instead was in the perfume industry, which when you think about it kind of makes sense because we all know how closely tied aroma and flavor sensations are. So they found that by distilling a liquid mixture and being able to separate it into its components, they were able to condense certain aspects of it and really strengthen them and produce something entirely new and different. The first distillation in Europe was probably from grapes, was probably a fruit-based base that today would be known as brandy. Whiskey came a little later. when they learned about fermenting grains. So fermentation is the process of taking cereal grains, malting them, which we'll go over, which creates simpler sugars in the grain for the yeast to consume and produce alcohol, and then heating it up because the liquid vaporizes at different times and different temperatures, and then very intentionally cooling down those vapors and collecting the ones that you want to keep and collecting the ones that have flavor and aroma compounds, and losing the ones that you don't. And that's how you create a base spirit, and that's the basic process of creating whiskey. The first country to really be known for its whiskey production was Ireland, and Matt's going to go into the Irish whiskey history a little bit.
Yeah, and so you guys have probably all heard about Jameson, Bushmill, some of the bigger brands from Ireland, but there's actually a rich history behind them as well. Sort of piggybacking off what David said about perfumes, Irish monks actually drank perfume, and they realized that it was also had, you know, a fun time while they were doing it, and so then they started distilling things themselves. Now, to be called an Irish whiskey, it has to be made in Ireland. It has to be under 9.48 ABV pre-aging, so before it's put in the barrels. It has to be fermented by yeast and has a mash of malted cereal grains. Now, what you'll hear there, except for Ireland, is a lot of things that are just kind of the definition of whiskey. Now, within Irish whiskey, there are a couple different types. There's going to be single malt, which means it's made at a single distillery. That's what the single is. And then malt means it's going to be malted barley. And then there's also pot still, single pot still whiskey. Again, single is going to be just coming from the one distillery rather than blending it from a couple other distilleries from around. But that can be used malted and unmalted barley. Now, the reason for that is because in the 16th century, the king decided he wanted to get a little piece of the action with the money that was making. Irish whiskey was very popular all throughout far reaches the British Empire. And so he said you had to pay taxes on that. Now, those were called Parliament Irish whiskies. And then it was actually called poteen, which eventually turned into pot still. Now, whiskeys like Green Spot are going to have stood the test of time with that, and it's a process still used to this day, but it's going to be used in the smaller pots rather than larger fermentation containers. In 1821, there was only 32 distilleries in Ireland, but so they started opening up the laws and regulations on it, and so by 1823, they were actually producing 10 million gallons of whiskey, which was more than even Scotland was doing at the time. Then in 1832, everything kind of flipped. Aeneas Coffee invented the coffee still, which was a much more efficient way of doing things. But the Irish were a little set in their ways, and so they resisted that sort of mechanization for a while. That's where you get the difference of the spelling of the word whiskey. Before that, it was all spelled whiskey, just with a Y at the end. And the Irish, in order to differentiate from all the other whiskeys made around the world, they added an E in there. And you'll actually see that in American bourbons and actually around the world, with the exception of Scotland, Japanese Scotch, and some Canadian blends as well. Then in the late 1980s, there was a revival. So with that, they're kind of sticking to their old ways, and America was kind of the last place that was buying Irish whiskey, and then Prohibition hit. And so in the late 1880s, you really see everything start to ramp up, and all the Irish whiskeys sort of blow up that you see today. Now, the word whiskey actually comes from an Irish term, phrase from Gaelic. Let me see if I can pronounce it. Uispera, which means water of life, and uispera, so it slowly became whiskey. Now, just to touch on a little bit of Scotch, I'm going to pass it over to Davis.
So I'm going to backtrack just a moment, and I'm going to go through the term malted. One of the big, it's a very common term. They can see how it would be one that would prevent people from engaging with whiskey. So I told you before that brandy came before whiskey because the sugars in fruit, in grapes, are much more accessible to the yeast. The process of malting barley is when the distiller starts the germination process of a cereal grain by soaking it in hot water. It kind of thinks that it's time to grow, and it contains the enzymes that actually breaks down its complex carbohydrates into simpler sugars that it would use to grow. And then this distiller will cut that process short and create a kind of liquid mixture, kind of a porridge that has a lot of simple sugars in it, to which the yeast is introduced. And then the yeast eats the sugars, produces alcohol, CO2, and heat, and that's fermentation. So the process of stopping the germination is a drying process. And Scotch is most well known for how it stops the germination process. They burn peat moss, a really dense moss that Scotland historically has used in the place of wood or lumber or timber. You think about Scotland, you think of the big wide prairies. You don't necessarily think of dense forests like you would with continental Europe or United States. So that's how they developed the process of using peat. And that's a big process. That's a big part of why Scotch is what it is the kind of smokiness and those flavor and aroma compounds that the malted barley picks up when they burn the peat to stop that germination process. Beyond that, as Matt said, Ireland, Scotland, the United Kingdoms, and their empire was a big part of the growth of whiskey, of which Scotch plays a large role. One thing that needs to be mentioned is wine was actually, for a long time, a big competitor to Scotch and to whiskeys. A louse in the late 1800s, 1880, 1890, called phylloxera, kind of decimated the wine industry. And that's when whiskey, Irish Scotch whiskey, really took off and became accessible to the masses, because wine was very difficult to produce for many decades there. As Matt said, the term Scotch, besides the flavor profiles brought about geographically in Scotland, is actually very limited to just the fact that it's made in Scotland. If you're in Scotland and you order Scotch, they're going to look at you funny because it's just called whiskey. So I really want you not to think of the terms Irish and Scotch and Bourbon and the ones we go over as reasons not to engage with it. They really actually have very simple and very easily to understand terms. And once you get past those terms and you get into different flavor profiles, and then you kind of can engage with what you might like, what you enjoy, and start the process of having your own relationship with whiskey. Scotland, as a relatively small country, is broken down to 5 subdivisions for the Scotch production. And when you talk about Scottish whiskey, you're basically talking about different intensities of how much peat is used. You have Islay, Highlands, Lowlands, Campbelltown, and Speyside. Islay, Speyside are known for being heavily peated whiskeys, which will have a lot of those smoky compounds. If that's something you enjoy, that's my favorite kind of Scotch. I encourage you to explore those areas. Lowlands, Campbelltown, a little smoother, a little less smoky, more richer, fuller sensation in the mouth. That's another way to approach Scotch as well. The cocktail we've chosen today to present to you to kind of introduce you to Scotch is the Highball. It's also one of the simplest cocktails you're ever going to find. It's pretty much just Scotch and soda water. It allows those complex aromas and flavor profiles, the nuanced stuff. You're not covering it up with a strong mixer, and you're not over diluting it, but you are making it nice and approachable and smooth. Oh, something else I did want to go over. As Matt was talking about the ABV requirements for producing whiskey, that distillation process, as that spirit comes off distilled, as they're turning that vapor back into liquid alcohol, that's traditionally up 60, 80% alcohol. And what we consume here, most of it is 40%, about 80 proof. In that process, the distiller is bringing down the ABV by adding water. And it's one of the biggest misconceptions that I see at the bar, which upsets me, is people being overwhelmed by the intensity of and the burn of the alcohol, and then saying that that's not for them. There is no shame in adding ice cube, a couple drops of water to make it enjoyable. Trust us, whiskey is strong enough that it can take it. You're not insulting the distiller. They've already added water. It really is, it's completely acceptable, and I encourage you to figure out what you enjoy. So Connor here is going to play a clip of Matt yesterday making a Scotch highball, and he'll narrate it for you.
Yep. So I came to Dish and Dram yesterday to film Matt in action behind the bar. So we got some videos for you, and you guys are really experts. I'm learning a lot. I used to live in Ireland, and I really enjoyed whiskey when I was there. So you guys are awesome.
Here we go. And again, like Davis was saying, this is going to be one of the simpler cocktails you'll see. It's just going to be Scotch poured over ice. I did a 2-ounce pour, so you can get it. That's going to be a 16-ounce glass there. I chose the Monkey Shoulder Scotch. It's one of my favorites. It's actually going to be blended Scotch. Monkey Shoulder gets its name from before mechanization. The people that worked at the distillery had to mill the peat by hand. And that was a process that required moving large amounts with your shoulders. So because of that, people that work there would actually end up being slumped over a little bit because their back muscles were so much stronger than on their front. And there was a condition called monkey shoulder, and also makes a really good Scotch. Nice one.
International.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So going after the Scotch, the Japanese actually make what they like to call Scotch there too. Some people in Scotland aren't as pleased about it, but they do put out a very nice high quality. The Yamazaki 12 was actually rated best whiskey in the world a couple years back. Starts out in Japan of 1819. A man named Masatsuka Tasasuri went to Scotland and studied with some of the master distillers there. And then he brought it back and they started distilling in Yamazaki. It's going to be very similar to Highland Scotches, and basically they will replicate almost any of the styles there. It's going to be more aromatic and a little bit lighter than the traditional Scotches that you're probably Macallan's, Taliskers, anything you're more used to, Glenfiddich. That comes from actually the oak trees that grow in Japan. Now, at first, when they started, they were importing oak from America, from France, in order to age it, because with the quick aging process of 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, even 8 years, produced a really sharp and not as enjoyable whiskey. But they found out that if you left it in there for about 20 years, it became smooth, velvety, and perfect. It's not as popular as kind of the other four we're going to touch on, but it is a very nice whiskey to try if you can. Now, moving on to rye. Oh, that's right. Yeah. I apologize. We're doing bourbon next.
So bourbon is probably the name most people know. It's probably the most common, at least well-known, where we're broadcasting in the United States. And just to kind of sum up some of the terms, Japanese, Scotch, Irish, bourbon, a lot of those terms are defined locally. Their international usage can be a little different. They're only enforced by trade agreements. They don't necessarily have to be apples to apples the same. So bourbon is an American term. It's an American product. It is not necessarily produced in Kentucky. Any state in the US can produce bourbon. It basically, the predominant definition is that it's 51% corn. So like we were talking about the European, Irish, and Scotch whiskeys, those were predominantly barley. The corn production in the US made bourbon more corn focused. So it has to be 51% corn. If there's a large amount of wheat in the mash bill, then you'll find a wheated bourbon, or a large amount of rye in that other 49%. It's a high rye bourbon, but that 51% corn is where that comes from. The other definition of bourbon is that they're all aged in new oak new charred oak barrels. So every time a barrel is filled, there's kind of a first fill, second fill, third fill, a greater percentage of the vanillin and tannic structure that is gained from the char and from the barrel is used. So bourbon is famous for that very creamy vanillin charred flavor, almost a little brown sugar flavor, because they're only ever allowed to use new oak barrels. So it's also another reason that you'll find a lot of bourbon barrel aged products, beer, wine, etc. The market actually has a lot of these single-use barrels on there, and the barrels are very expensive. So that is a predominant part of bourbon. It's also because there's more sugar in the corn. It's actually was the first time that whiskey really embraced a little sweetness, and the sensation of sweetness can create a very full mouthfeel, as opposed to something of spice or acidic kind of flavor profiles, which are more linear and more crisp. So that's why bourbon has really become one of the predominant whiskeys of cocktails. We're going to go here into the old fashioned, so-called because it was one of the original cocktails, to the point where it almost didn't need a name, and it was just called the old fashioned cocktail. So here Connor's going to play you a clip of Matt making an old fashioned.
Before I play the clip, I have a quick question from Wendy. She loves bourbon. It's her favorite whiskey. And she's wondering, can you please talk about the bitters that you should use to enhance the cocktails, especially with bourbon?
Sure. So like I said, it's like how, because of that corn flavor profile or the corn sweetness, can create a very full mouthfeel. Once you start playing around with it, you do find that a bittering agent, like bitters, can create a little nice contrast to that, a little crispness at the beginning and end of your tastes. So that's actually very important to include bittering agents or bittering if you want to balance out a cocktail, especially something like a Manhattan or an old fashioned, in which you've actually added a little simple syrup or some sugar to it in vermouth. That bittering agent is what can bring that back to a more crisp and a more kind of balanced flavor profile, and not overly sweet or overly kind of viscous in your mouth.
And also in the past couple of years, I would say, what, about 10, 15, there's been more flavored bitters, which you can completely change the complexity of your drink. So one of the ones I really like to use, you're going to see a traditional old fashioned in a second, but I will do a butterscotch old fashioned. You switch the ingredients around, and then you add chocolate bitters, and it interacts with the agave, and it gives it a real unique flavor that doesn't really match up with anything else. I like using sometimes cherry bitters in a summertime old fashioned, things like that. So the old fashioned really is something you can jump off of in very different directions and make it taste very differently, but it all comes from the same basic spot.
Wendy says, wow to butterscotch.
Well, come on down.
And then we had two actually other questions. One was going back to Scotch. So one of our attendees, Carol, she toured the, I don't want to mispronounce it, but it's Edradour, Edradour distillery. And she's new to whiskey. So she's wondering if you know about this brand and its reputation.
Should have put it on the table. You want to take that one a little bit? I actually don't know a ton about Edradour. We actually just brought it into the restaurant just a couple weeks back. That's actually my first experience with it. Do you have more personally?
Just a little bit, yeah. It's newer to me as well. I know that it is going to be a family farm Scotch, which makes it a little bit smaller and more distinct, and so it's going to be a little bit more expensive because it's harder to come by. It's interesting because as a Scotch, I feel like it drinks a little bit more like a dark rum, so you'll get kind of those thicker molasses flavors. And circling back to the bitters question, if I'm making an old fashioned with that, I'm going to use orange bitters to kind of highlight it, just like I would with a dark aged rum.
And one last question, how much sugar is in a glass of bourbon?
Well,
depends how much bourbon you drink in your glass.
Well, funnily enough, most drinks, just as a rule, this isn't specifically to answer your question, most drinks have a very similar caloric value. Once you've changed the amount of volume for beer, wine, liquor, you actually end up pretty much coming between 90 to 130 calories per drink. whiskey I expect to be in that realm as well. That's just a rule of thumb that I use for beer, wine, and certain things. I feel pretty confident that whiskey will fall in that range.
All right, now we can get to the old fashioned.
Okay, and so the old fashioned is something you definitely want to mix in the glass. The reason for that is you don't want to dilute this drink too much. You're going to start with Eich's, the Elijah Craig Bourbon. For this one, they're small batch. It's really good and it's a great value as well. So you're going to put the ice in there. What I did was I made a brown sugar simple syrup, which is just going to be brown sugar and water. And that's going to be mixed and heated together. The reason I'm doing that is to accent those flavors that Davis was talking about when he was talking about bourbon. So you get that molasses, goes really well with the vanilla, and gives it a little bit more unique feel than just sort of your granulated white sugars. As an accent, you want to go traditionally with a little lemon twist. Put it around the edge of the glass so that you get the flavors throughout and the oils. And I'm struggling a little bit here to get the cherry out. I like using the Luxardo cherries. They're a lot better than the maraschino cherries. In my opinion, they're going to be soaked in alcohol themselves. So they are a little bit of fun there, just by on there. And there we go. We're ready to drink.
And just to chime in on old fashions, if you do go to a bar, not the Dish and Dram, that is how we'll make your old fashioned if you order it here. But if you go elsewhere, there was a time period in which old fashions were made a little differently, a much heavier hand with muddling the fruit, the citrus, get more oils out. After Prohibition, there was a little bit, there was a period of time in which the quality of the whiskey produced was not necessarily what you'd expect, or it could be, there was some nefarious action going on as well. That actually is the term bottled and bond. It's the government kind of stepping in there. But so there's kind of two different types of old fashioned. You might get some with muddled cherry, muddled citrus, and a little kind of covering up the whiskey. We've embraced the idea that the whiskey nowadays is produced much better, high quality stuff. No reason to cover it up if that's what you're ordering. And so that's and I think most bars in the area, I think will probably produce it that way. But there is something to keep an eye out for in the other way.
And sometimes when I'm making an old fashioned, actually as an homage to the old way that it was made, I will use just 1 or 2 dashes of Angostura bitters, which is going to be your traditional bitters that you're most used to and accompanied to. And then I'm going to add 1 dash of cherry bitters and 1 dash of orange bitters, because the fruit that was muddled was more often going to be cherry, orange, and lemon. And you really are, lemon's such a distinct flavor. Just with the twist as the garnish, you get a lot of the flavor there.
And then a fun little note about that cocktail, there's a lot of apocryphal stories about bourbon, where it started, where the name comes from. There's actually no unanimous agreement on that, but one of them is that Elijah Craig was the inventor of bourbon. But I think that's been dismissed, but it's a fun little note about Elijah Craig whiskey. As much as anybody invented it, he was up there. He's in the top tier. So next is whiskey sour. Also very traditional, probably less seen now than in the past, but at one time, a very common drink. So here's Matt making a whiskey sour.
So the first thing you'll notice here is that I'm not going to make it starting in the glass. We're actually going to start in the shaker tin. You're going to have a little bit of simple syrup. So this one, since it's interacting with the citrus, I will just use your traditional sugar water instead of the brown sugar. Then we're going to add fresh squeezed lemon juice with that as well. And we'll put that in there too. The lemon juice is the reason that it's in the shaker tin. With the citrus, you want to activate that and dilute it a little bit more. So you shake it, not too much so that it gets all the way watered down. And then of course you add the bourbon. I picked Jim Beam for this, just to highlight, since when you have all these mixers, to use maybe a higher end bourbon, some of the complexities would be lost. So if you're using a Jim Beam, if you like Bullet, whatever the one, if I'm going cheap whiskey sometimes, I'll even go all the way down to Virginia Gentleman or something like that. If you mix it and if you make the cocktail properly, that'll all be good for you. But here we get the shake. You want to make sure that you have the ice hit every part of the drink. That's why I look a little weird going up and down, back and forth, and not just straight up and down, so that you really slosh it around. Add fresh ice to the glass. And then we are going to do what's called a double strain. That's just to make sure the big chunks don't fall out. And then I'm going to grab my micro strainer and pour on top so that all the chips get in there. Because nobody wants to take a nice big sip and then get a little tiny piece of ice that's unsettling a little bit. And then our garnish here, again, is going to be our brandied cherry. And I learned my lesson this time. I had it already on the pit. There we go, ready to drink.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the difference between shaking and stirring and the purpose of it?
Yeah, so with stirring, you really are trying to elevate. Usually when you stir, you're not going to have citrus in it, and you don't want to dilute the drink as much. Where you shake, it really does wake up the drink and allows the flavors to shine through.
So the last is rye.
Rye, sure. So the next one we're moving into is rye. So rye is the other American spirit. Rye, just like bourbon, is going to be made predominantly in the U.S. Canadians do make some good ryes as well. Crown Royal Rye, it's actually a really nice one. Pretty reasonably priced as well. But you're going to have 51% rye or more rather than 51% corn, like there was in the bourbon. Now this gives it a distinct flavor. It's got a spice to it, but don't think spice like jalapeno peppers, Tabasco, or even black pepper. Think of baking spices, but without the sugar. So if you can think of bread with no sugar, it's kind of hard to sort of conceptualize, but that's what you're going to get as the predominant flavor for the rye. And rye is very local. So in the 1600s, the German and Dutch from Pennsylvania teamed up with the Irish and Scotch from Maryland to create what's called Maryland rye. Now the Pennsylvania rye whiskey was also done as well. So the difference between the two is the rye and barley is going to be in the Pennsylvania rye whiskey, and in the Maryland rye whiskey is the rye and corn. Now, based on what we said on Scotch, you can expect the Pennsylvania style rye whiskey to be a little bit more, what's the word? Linear.
Grainy, more,
Grainy,
less full in the mouth, more crisp, more kind of spicy. Yeah.
And then the Maryland rye, that's going to be a little bit sweeter, so that'll edge towards bourbon. I hate to say more spicy, less spicy, because then people sometimes, they expect it to be high. And then after 1776, America was cut off from the Caribbean islands, so we couldn't get our favorite spirit at the time, which was rum, because that's where all the molasses came from. And rye became the predominant spirit that was drank in the US. In 1810, there was about 3 times as many rye distilleries produced, gallons of rye produced than bourbon in America. And then aged rye came about actually kind of an accidental discovery as they were being shipped in barrels across the country. It added to the profile and they very much liked it. Customers did. Now, rye was pricier than bourbon to make. And so when Prohibition happened in the 1920s, the bootleggers were able to make bourbon a lot more easily. And all the rye had to be imported from Canada. And it was usually considered like lower tier, you're below the rail sort of whiskeys. And so it kind of started getting this bad rap. And over time, Hollywood would produce that only bourbon was being drank by the sophisticated and all that sort of stuff. And so once we got up to the 1980s, rye had kind of fallen out of favor. And then there has been a 500% increase since 2009. Sort of as an apology to the rye community. If you guys ever seen the show Mad Men, they specifically have Don Draper when he's talking to Conor at Hilton order a rye Manhattan, and everyone's kind of been piggybacking on that. And the craze has been getting better and better. And there's some great Maryland ryes. Sagamore right here. As you can tell, it's very well lined. There's barely any left. It's a great distillery that is local. It's up in Baltimore and actually has some roots in Kensington as well. Their owner, his mother, used to be the mayor of Kensington proper.
Yep. So that's the Planks. Just to throw one in the bus. So Jay Plank and Kevin Plank is the owner of Under Armour, Maryland alum. He started Sagamore Spirits and as an ode to the history Matt was talking about. They produce exclusively rye whiskeys. They're doing pretty well. One thing I did want to go over, I'm sorry we're running out of time. There's so many things, so many specific terms. Like I said at the beginning, the goal is really to give you guys a comfort level so that you can continue this discussion on your own with bartender or with the salesman at the DLC. Figure out what you like. We mentioned, I'm gonna go age statements really quick because I think that's one of the most prohibitive aspects of a whiskey bottle, that when you're looking at it, an age statement references the youngest whiskey in the bottle. A lot of whiskeys are blends, so you see them counting 12 is a 12-year. That means the youngest whiskey in that bottle will be aged 12 years in cask. Whiskey only ages in barrel. Once it gets bottled, it no longer changes. It's different than wine like that. So you see the corkage of whiskey bottles are not corked. There's something stopping the air from getting in. Generally, when you age a whiskey, it loses some of the spicy notes and gains a little oxidation, a little reductive value that creates a smoother profile. So that's in general why whiskey is a little more expensive the older you get. A little bit of it evaporates out of the barrel, so you need to make up that product. I think the sweet spot for someone starting out, 6 to 8 to 10 years, no real reason to go much beyond that until you've comfort level. Anything beyond 14, 18, you're probably, at least in my personal opinion, you're not necessarily getting your dollars for dollars increase in enjoyment at that point. So that's generally how I approach age statements.
Do you want to do, just to touch on Tennessee whiskey, it's going to be made in Tennessee. It's very close to bourbon as well. One of the biggest difference is that, well, also you can use used charred oak barrels, but it's filtered over charcoal, so you get a distinct mesquite taste to it.
We have one more cocktail here for you that Matt made with the Sagamore Rye. This is our Manhattan, which Conor will play for you here.
Okay, here we go. We're moving into the Manhattan, and as you see, this is going to be a stirring cocktail. That's a mixing tin right there. You're going to have 2 ounces of the rye here, and the recipe Manhattans are really fun and easy to remember because the area code Manhattan is going to be 212. You're going to have 2 ounces of your base, which we chose rye here. You can also make it with bourbon, and then 1 ounce of your sweet vermouth. I like using the Dolan. It's a good baseline vermouth. And then 2 dashes of the Angostura bitters. Now we're going to stir. And when you stir, you really want to stay around the outside of the glass. So you want to keep it loose in your hand. You don't want to be breaking the ice cubes up, diluting the water too much. And then you're going to have a cherry again for garnish. Seems to be a theme with the cherry garnishes. They go very well with whiskey.
We like our cherries here, our fancy cherry.
And then I always double strain as well, just to make sure you don't get a little bit, even though you're trying your best with the stir and you're going to dilute it a whole lot less. You're going to break a whole lot less of the ice chips. There we go.
And if you have never experimented with the fancy expensive cherries, I highly recommend you do. They're pretty different from the maraschino. They're pretty fantastic.
Also good on ice cream sundaes.
Also good on ice cream sundaes. Well, that was a fast 45 minutes. Happy to take questions. And of course, you're always welcome to come down to the Dish and Dram and continue this with Matt and I here. But I think that's it for us for today.
We have just one other question. So Betsy was wondering, how do you know kind of what's a good bottle of whiskey to get somebody? I know that's a big question because there's so many different types, but maybe she's bringing it to a party as a gift. Well, parties haven't happened in a long time, but as a gift. What would you recommend?
I try to stay away from the things I see advertised on TV, because that you kind of want the things that already have a name for themselves. Like Green Spot, you want something that's approachable. And don't go for something with a fancy label as well. I don't know. It's kind of an open-ended.
Yeah. So I guess I'm assuming that you're asking if you're flying blind, if you don't know what kind of whiskey you like. I think
I would say that. Yeah,
that's really difficult. I would at that point, I would kind of, if you know for a fact that they're a whiskey lover, I think you kind of have to bite the bullet and ask them, at least in generalities, what they enjoy. I have a fear that if you get a whiskey drinker, something that, and they've already established, they have already come to terms in what they like, and they know that, getting that person a bottle that is outside of that is probably it's probably not what you're going for. And then if you are just going to fly blind and you want to surprise them, or if they don't know whiskeys as well, and you want to get them the bottle to get into it, and you're starting from that, I think you want to look at something 6 to 8. My favorite nowadays, especially if this is a non-whiskey drinker, is Irish whiskey. In their production, it's triple pot distilled. Creates a much smoother kind of whiskey than, say, a Scotch or Bourbon. The knock on Irish whiskeys is that I think of them as the opposite of rye. So the way that we describe rye as being a little spicier and having that rye forward flavor profile, which has a lot of flavor to it. Irish whiskey, in general, all pot distilled whiskeys are distilled at least twice. So they heat up the liquid in a giant pot, and then the vapor goes off, and then they collect that and they put that back into the pot, and they do it a second time. And then for Irish whiskey, they do it a third time, which at the cost of maybe a little bit, some of those volatile compounds or the flavor aromatic compounds that might degrade in that process. What you do get is you also lose the coarser compounds, or the ones that create a harsher flavor profile. So, so I can't be more specific, but yeah, for non-drinker, Irish. For a drinker, I think you got to bite the bullet and kind of gauge what they like and do that way.
And we're right down the street. We're always trying to we like drinking these whiskeys. We're always looking at the new ones that are coming to the area. Pop in, have a glass of wine if you're not a drinker, a beer, talk to one of us for 2 or 3 minutes. We're happy to. It's one of the fun aspects of our job. And so just stop on by, and hopefully we can help guide you in a direction.
Thank you both so much for this. You're excellent. And I know everybody learned a ton today. And I just want to say, so we'll be picking 5 random names, and we'll give you a little coupon for a free cocktail at Dish and Dram, and then 10% off of your meal. So you can get that to go or dine in, which I know that they are doing now. And they're busy. They got to get back to their restaurant. It's open as we speak. So I really want to thank you both for taking the time to share your expertise with us. And just we're really grateful, and have a great day.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.